Mythic Battles Pantheon is a tabletop RPG by Monolith based on the massively successful board game of the same name, which came out in 2017 and puts you in charge of drafting war bands of Greek gods and champions. The idea of this role-playing game is to utilize the incredible body of illustrations as well as the battle maps, dice, and miniatures from the board game if you happen to own it, and put those towards a more open-ended collaborative story. You don't need the original board game to play this RPG. Monolith has done this before though. I've actually covered their Batman Gotham City Chronicles RPG published in 2022, which was based on the sprawling board game of the same name. In that case, the RPG used a French spin-off of the old D&D 3rd edition rule set that I did find personally a bit cumbersome. In the case of this game, Mythic Battles Pantheon, the rules are way simpler and more cinematic and narrative focused. That isn't to say there isn't complexity in this game. In this video, I want to walk you through a brief overview of the Greek mythology setting of the game, wherein there's a sort of alternate timeline after a certain point that diverges from the actual mythology, then show you character creation, then the basic mechanics. Then I'll give you my honest thoughts on the game. The 300-page core rulebook is actually so loaded with monsters, NPCs, champions, and setting lore that I can't really show you everything, but hopefully you'll get the gist and can decide if this would be a good fit for your table. Just for some general context here, I should note that Mythic Battles Pantheon is one of a trilogy of RPGs, each based on its respective board game. Pantheon is Greek mythology, Ragnarok is ancient Norse mythology, and Isfet covers ancient Egyptians. I'm not really going to be referencing those other two games very much, but it's interesting that this product line is really pretty broad right out of the gate. The rule sets across the three RPGs are largely the same, so there's at least the option to pivot to other settings besides this one without learning an entirely new set of rules. I don't know if you're very well versed in Greek mythology. I thought I knew some stuff until I stumbled upon this family tree found at the beginning of one of graphic novelist George O'Connor's Greek Pantheon series. Needless to say, Greek mythology is quite complex, and unless you majored in the subject, you probably don't know as much as you think you do. Fortunately, this core rulebook gives you about 9 pages of primer to get acquainted with the story and with how they alter the mythology a bit in order to load the setting for this particular game. But if you really want to get into it, there are about 24 pretty intense pages detailing the timeline in detail. Also, this is as good a time as any to point out the quality of the illustrations for this game. More frequently than not, when a board game company does an RPG port of one of their games, the artwork is pretty stunning. And this is just one of those instances where an initial crowdfund campaign raises millions and the company is able to recruit some very high caliber talent. Anyway, the book goes for another 40 pages detailing the various locations of the world. I think my only complaint here is not knowing exactly where the real mythology ends and the fabricated one for the game begins. It certainly all feels like authentic mythology. It's just that after reading all this stuff, my real world knowledge might be a bit distorted. But let's circle back and go over what the game wants you to know about the timeline. In the beginning, there were only Titans, but the Titans gave birth to the god Zeus. Eventually, there were a bunch of gods like Zeus, but none as powerful as he, and these gods ended up going to war with the Titans. That war was known as the Titanomachy, and it lasted for 10 years until the gods eventually won out and locked the Titans away in massive clay vases. Thus blossomed the Age of Heroes, where humans and demigods and gods interacted and flourished, and most of the stories from Greek myth that we know unfold here. During this time, there was one major source of problems in the world that would end up blowing up everything, and that was Zeus's infidelity. Although he was a major philanderer, his wife Hera tended to more or less tolerate the behavior, but over time, Zeus grew to be a bit of a solipsist, not even pretending to care about the feelings of Hera or of any other god for that matter. It was then, when Zeus had completely abandoned all pretense, when Hera decided she would have her revenge on him. She recruited one of her sons, Dionysus, the god of food and wine, to help her sneak into the depths of the underworld and release the Titans from their giant clay jars. Long story short, they succeeded, but when Hera commanded them to avenge her, they basically all laughed in her face and launched a second war on the gods, a second Titanomachy. Okay, so in case you were wondering, there is no second war between the Titans and the gods in real Greek mythology. This whole thing with Hera and Dionysus sneaking down and releasing the Titans is all new material meant as a setup for Mythic Battles Pantheon. And so is the fallout from the Second War, which resulted in basically a complete apocalypse. All but 3 human cities have been destroyed. There are volcanoes everywhere. Even Mount Olympus has been leveled. Actually, that detail is particularly important because that mountain contained a magical rock material that acted as the source of divine power. And those stones have been scattered all across the land. In the board game, if you could manage to collect 4 pieces of this stone, you'd win the game. In this RPG, you can spend the stones on all kinds of little power-ups. Anyway, the world is now a living hell, almost literally. Monsters and heroes are pouring out of the underworld. Gods are employing human champions left and right to do their bidding. And in the chaos of it all, gods are getting killed, possibly permanently if they die at the hands of another god. In all that chaos, you enter either as a champion of a god or a titan, or as a hero with no alignment. To create your character, you need to assign 20 points to 4 different core attributes called qualities, then set your defense rating to 5 and your vitality to 7. You will then fill up your 4 gift slots. These slots will go inactive as you take more damage, but the 4th slot will always be active. Normal mortal gifts that you can choose from include the following. Notice that these are largely not very game-changing, and they almost all pertain to combat, which is understandable since this game is based on a skirmish board game. Things get a little more interesting if you align your hero to one god or another and lock yourself into certain behavioral tenets and values. If you manage to do so, you have access to that god's gifts. To be honest though, even these gifts are not really that monumental. Notice that when it says once per chapter, that means once per game session. You'll see that a lot in this game where abilities can only be used once per session. There are 10 gods that you can align with in the core rulebook, each demanding that you behave a certain way in order to earn their favor. Ares, for example, is the brutal god of war, so he's going to want you to never back down from a challenge and always use force. Artemis is the goddess of wild animals, hunting, and chastity, so life is sacred and you're not really meant to have carnal relations. I do like the options that these 10 gods offer. I think they provide plenty of variety in terms of the gifts that they afford you and the tenets that you have to follow, but the book says that even more gods will be on offer in future supplements. The original board game came with 4 gods, and its several expansions provided a total of over 15 more, so there are a lot more gods out there to potentially align with. Importantly, there's a pretty central mechanic in the game that actually enforces all those tenets that the gods hold over your head. It's a system of meta points called creeds. There are 7 creeds in the game that you track on your character sheet, and the GM will award you points based on your character's behavior and decision making. You can do 2 things with creeds. The first is spend them to re-roll dice or use an inactive slot's gift, or even reorder gifts into different slots, but you can actually only spend creed like this once per session. The second thing you can do is if you fill up a whole row of creed points, then you can spend all 5 pips at once to either receive a new gift or increase one of your stats. This is essentially how leveling up your character works, so you're definitely incentivized to run your character in accordance with certain tenets. Okay, the way the dice work in this game is that you're using d6 pools, but it does get a little complex, at least at first blush. The specialty dice feature the numbers 1 through 5 with 6s being blank. If you don't have those dice, you'll just learn to ignore and throw out any rolled 6s. For any test, or trial as they're called, the GM will select one of 4 of the core qualities, then determine the complexity, which is usually 1 to 3 successes required for a roll. Then comes the rolling, which is where it might get a bit confusing. So first you roll the number of dice equal to the quality you're testing. For example, if you're testing your might and you have a 4 in that quality, then you roll 4 d6s. If you roll any blanks or 6s, then those are discarded unless you have a gift that utilizes them in some way. Then you can spend any remaining die to add a +1 to another die. You basically sacrifice the die in order to boost another. In the case of this example, you'll end up with 2 dice that have a value of 5. after you've boosted one of them. Then comes an optional second roll where you can then re-roll your remaining dice for a chance at getting those dice values up even higher. But on this re-roll, if you roll a blank or a 6, then that whole die is a bust. However, if you roll high enough, you can bolster the dice to 7 or higher. 7, by the way, is the default target threshold for what counts as a success, which is to say, when you're trying to roll multiple successes, you're essentially trying to roll multiple 7s with d6s, and the only way to get there is to sacrifice dice and oftentimes risk the second roll in order to generate enough value to consolidate into successes. Combat affords each character 2 actions per turn by default, but some actions require 2 actions, as seen in this table. Apoidi, by the way, are what this game calls magic spells. Generally speaking, the game is trying to keep combat fast and narrative, so it uses range zones, or in the alternative, if you happen to be using the board game's battle maps, general areas. Attacks are made by testing one's might quality for a melee attack and one's poise quality for a ranged attack by default. The number of successes that are scored will determine how many vitality points an enemy loses. One important thing to note is that the GM never rolls in combat. Instead, the players will roll a defense check anytime an enemy attacks them. Their defense rating tells them how many dice they would roll for that check. As mentioned earlier, if your character loses vitality, they start losing the ability to use gifts one by one until there's just one active slot. Then if they reach 0 vitality, they're at death's door and either get revived by a party member or roll a series of 4 tests over the next 4 turns called shock trials, where they have to test each of their 4 qualities in turn. They have to fail all 4 of these tests in order to actually die, but even if that happens, the game gives the GM the formal option of allowing the player to cheat death for narrative reasons. It says here that where a champion is pivotal to the ongoing story, they can just sort of sidestep death. I can't imagine an RPG session where a player character is not an important part of an ongoing story. To me, this passage reads as, you don't ever have to die in this game if you don't want to. I find the approach to weapons pretty cool, actually. Each weapon type carries a distinct mechanic that colors its behavior in combat. The only mechanic that I did find kind of odd was the one for the mace or flail, which says that you have to re-roll all 3s. I'm not able to parse out the logic for that, but most of these weapon mechanics are very logical. Oh, remember how Mount Olympus got blown up and all those magical stones got scattered across the land? They're called Omphaloi or Omphalos in the singular, and they act as the only real currency in the game. You're not meant to worry about money or trade in this game, but you are quite focused on acquiring and using Omphaloi. They can be used to boost a dice roll for a trial, summon an avatar to aid in one combat or scene, recover all lost vitality, or broken up into pieces and given as offerings for your god. Although how many little shards a lump will produce when you shatter it is completely up to the GM. If you have a leadership gift, you can command groups of NPCs referred to as troops, and they never really die, they just get exhausted. It's very board gamey if you think about it. But troops come in the form of 3 different levels of actual soldiers, as well as centaurs and hounds of Artemis, which I thought was really cool, and infernal hounds and infernal warriors. The book warns the GM not to allow more than 2 players in any given party to have troops, because it could become a real slog in combat. There are also 18 named champions in the book that the GM will insert as NPCs here and there, and these really tie the game to the underlying mythology in my opinion, because these are the characters from the stories we know. Each of these champions is loaded with backstory naturally, but notice the stat block for them. They're very straightforward and simple. Actually, a number of these champions are pretty deep cuts that I don't recognize, but I appreciate that too because it gives me a chance to become a little more acquainted with Greek mythology. I mean, you're going to need to take the lore as presented here with a grain of salt. In the case of Icarus, for example, he has been resurrected as a mighty warrior, coming back hot with completely redesigned wings that allow him to give air support on the battlefield. Probably my most favorite part of any RPG is the monster section, and although you only get 24 monsters in this core rulebook, They're each lavishly illustrated, and again, notice that the relative simplicity of the rules means that the stat blocks are really rather simple. These monsters don't all have to be fought in battle necessarily. I think there's enough lore detail for each that you can construct social encounters, or at least non-combat puzzles and problems for the players to solve that involve the monster. Alright, here are my thoughts on Mythic Battles Pantheon. Cons. The dice mechanic. The system of sacrificing dice to boost others, combined with a once and only once reroll rule, would take a certain amount of getting used to, and I don't think it would be easy to track in a virtual tabletop unless you had a specifically programmed dice roller. At least at first blush, it seems like the dice create some complexity that would slow down the very fast and narrative nature that the game otherwise embraces very strongly. Elysium's boon is too soft. The explicit instruction for GMs to bypass character death if a hero is pivotal removes any sense of genuine stakes. Without the threat of loss, the tactical depth of the combat feels like maybe it's a bit moot. If you never die, what's the point of self-preservation? Pros. Creed system. This is a standout mechanic to me. By tying character progression and metacurrency directly to the tenets of the gods, the game mechanically enforces role-player behavior and ensures the players remain grounded in their god's tenets. No minutia. The game strips away the tedious bookkeeping of encumbrance, currency, and gear tracking. It allows the table to focus entirely on the more epic scale of the story. Gift management. The way that you can acquire new gifts and swap them in and out of your 4 slots is a very welcome feature that I think keeps a character interesting to play from session to session. Researched. Despite the fictional second Titanomachy, the depth of the primer and the inclusion of deep-cut mythological figures demonstrate a pretty high level of historical and literary care. Again, I do worry about mixing real mythology with the game's made-up details, but the overall richness of the lore is undeniable, and the fact that it's hard to tell what's genuine and what's fabricated for the game's setting is impressive in its own way. Artwork. Visual production is top tier. Some of the illustrations in the book are really the best I've ever seen for a given monster, and overall it's just a premium level of art direction and presentation, all in one book. Having the setting, rule set, GM section, champions, and bestiary in a single 300-page volume makes this a high-value proposition for a GM to pick up and run. Mythic Battles Pantheon is probably the most maximalist Greek mythology RPG I've ever come across in terms of visual impact and readiness for the table, and I'm an RPG guy, so this is obvious, but if I owned the original board game, I'd feel that this RPG would be a mandatory purchase. If you need distance-based movement, granular gear management, and more grittiness, this might really not be the game for you, but if you're looking for a Greek myth setting that prioritizes cinematic god tier action over granular simulation, this system delivers that experience in a very pretty, polished, and consolidated way. That's all I've got for now. Remember to like and subscribe for more RPG reviews, and join the channel as a member for exclusive videos and content. Links for everything are below. I'll see you in the next one.